I'm Nathalie. Back in 2008, I studied graphic design, which I enjoyed, but didn't enjoy it quite enough. And then in 2011, I did 2 internships as a 3D artist in games. And that's when I discovered I really enjoy doing art and I really enjoy working in games, but it still wasn't quite what I wanted to do. So in 2013, I started studying game design and production in the Netherlands. And I was completely convinced that I was going to be a producer in games, but it rarely goes the way you plan it. So I realized in my 3rd year that I have a profound love for UI and UX design, just to make things better for people. And yeah. So in 2016, that's when I did my internship at Coffee Stain, and 1 year later I was also hired at Coffee Stain, and that is where I've been ever since, working on Satisfactory. Important to say, I also have 2 cats, and one of them is actually in the game, so when you enable arachnophobia mode, my cat shows up in So Scary Spiders. And some other things that I do is I work with Donna Day once a year, and yes. Thank you. And Donna Day is a day once a year where we just want to inspire and educate women to get into the games industry. So we offer mentorships, we offer portfolio reviews. This year was the 3rd year that we've done this, and we had 50 students show up, so that was amazing. And another thing that I'm involved with is LTPF, for Leveling the Playing Field. This is an initiative that was started a few years ago by Coffee Stain, and it's an initiative to improve gender diversity in the industry. So if you're a startup or a small company and you have more than 50% female identifying employees, you can apply to this funding. So if you're interested in this, send an email. And before we get into the talk, I just want to show a 1-minute trailer of Satisfactory, just so you have a context of what the game is like and what it's about. And while this trailer is not a literal depiction of what the gameplay is actually like in the game, it is a reflection of how we want players to experience the game. So let's take a look. Or not. Hello? The video does not want to play. It's an embedded video. So. Hi. Yeah. Yeah.
Trying to make sure
That's why.
Yeah. It's no flame. Okay, so we're not doing a 1-minute trailer. That's okay. Okay, so now I've lost my notes. This is great. I'm sorry, I'm fixing it. So I'm just going to describe the game to you instead. We released Satisfactory in March this year, so 8 months ago. And you can best describe the game as a first-person, open-world building simulator. And the player takes on the role of an engineer. So you're working for a company called Fixit, which I will get into later. And the goal of this talk, like what I want to achieve with this talk, is to tell you why I think it's worth investing into good UI and UX. And with that said, it's going to be a very practical talk. And what I want to tell you is that UI is not just menus, it's much more than that. And it's not something that you sweep under the rug or that you save for the last point of development. And yeah, my intention is to show you why it's important. So how we're going to go through this is we'll go through UI and UX in a nutshell, then we'll talk about visual identity, we'll talk about the process of learning, how we've learned things about Satisfactory, and after that I'll touch upon what we've got planned in the future. And an important notice, after each chapter, I'm going to do a takeaway. So if you feel like, this is taking too long, basically the takeaway is a TLDR version of what I just said. So UI and UX in a nutshell. We're going to look at one of our main interactions in the game, which is the progression system that we have in the game. And the original intention with this screen was to offer the player a way of progressing through the game. So we have this idea that we wanted to create a type of skill tree, but not necessarily a skill tree. So there are no prerequisites to progress through this progression system. You don't need to complete one tier to move into the other. And when you look at the screen at first glance, it seems like it's okay. Like, you can interact with it, the color scheme is fine, but I'm gonna head into it now. So, one of the things is horizontal scrolling. It's something you want to avoid because it feels unnatural, people don't like it, and it removes the feeling of having an overview of the menu that you're progressing through. Another thing, point 2, is there are confusing terms. So I'm not sure if you can read it from there, but up there it says schematics tree, and on the right it says you get. So schematics tree is confusing because it is no tree, it is no skill tree. And you get is confusing because who is you in this case, and what do I get? Do I get rewards? No idea. Number 3 is the images. So while they are aesthetically pleasing, they're not really telling me anything as a user. Like, what are they? They're pretty, but I still don't know what they are. And this point is that it's extremely unfriendly for scaling. So if we would add anything else in those tiers, the entire design of this menu would break. And the last point is selecting. So at the top you have selected, but at the bottom right it also says make selected. So we don't know what happens when you press selected or when you press make selected. And it's important to note here that our job as UI and UX designers is to communicate with everyone because UI and UX involves everyone. We need to think about how these things affect the game and what we're trying to teach the player here. And what I think our issue was with this menu is that we were mostly thinking in terms of systems and not thinking in a way of the overall experience. So this is a current version that we have in the game. And one of the things is there's no more horizontal scrolling. We're using clear terminology, so at the top it says active milestone and select a milestone. We don't say you get, we say rewards. And we are looking at the milestone cost, and it's not as arbitrary as it was in the previous screen. The icon on the right is now aesthetically pleasing while people also understand what they're getting as a reward. And because we communicated with people in a team, we can now fit up to 8 different types of rewards in this menu without breaking the scale of the design. And the select milestone button is now highlighted so people understand, okay, when I click this, I think I know what's going to happen. And I want to give you some context on how we got here and why it's important to use wireframes and mockups. So how we started is with this, which is a nightmare. It's terribly convoluted, people don't understand where to start, what they're doing, and it lacks any kind of flow, so where does it begin and where does it end? So wireframing and mockupping is a great way to test your designs and to come to something that communicates your intention clearly. They're also a cheap way to test things early on, and it allows you to communicate those ideas quickly. And always ask yourself why. Why am I creating this, and why am I creating it in the way that I am right now? After that, we can add flair to our menus. So we have a little launch pad for our button, and people really enjoy pressing this button. So when you get to a point where you understand that your design works, you can give it something extra. And I hope that videos are now going to work, because I have another video. Doesn't look like it. Yes. Could you?
on Google Drive?
Yes.
And you have downloaded it?
Yes.
Because it says you can't download it.
Yeah.
You go out to the screen. Yeah, you can see the video playing on the left side. So there's something in the slide. You have it available on the web or something?
It should be available offline. That's why I'm confused.
Try that instead. Otherwise, through a browser or whatever. There's the moment of truth. No, tell me over.
Alright.
That is probably something else.
Yeah.
You have it like on YouTube or anything like that?
It's
Or as an asset, you drive?
I think it might work now. Yes.
Good stuff.
Awesome. Thank you. So this is an example of how the menu is used in the game, where we are trying to add to the player fantasy that we saw in the trailer, which you didn't see, but we can come back to that now. So you are an engineer working for this company, and what we want to add to here is that it's not just a menu that you're interacting with, but you're actually affecting the physical world around you in this game. How do you feel about going back to the trailer?
Yeah.
Why? Why do you do this? So yes, now you have some context. Getting back to where we were. So yeah, now this actually makes a bit more sense. So you're an engineer and you're working for this company, and yeah, you're affecting the world around you, and it's not just interacting with the menus that you see. And that is our intention. We want to make you feel like you are an engineer and you are affecting the things that you're doing. So UI and UX in a nutshell. UI and UX are not a linear process, they are an iterative process. So we go back and forth between stages. Sometimes you can go back a few months and decide on that design instead. And UI is the visual branding of your interactions. It's the color palette that you use, it's the shapes that you use, the affordances, the look and the feel. And UI and UX designers, like I said before, we have to communicate with everyone because UI and UX involve everyone and affect everyone. And UX starts from the very beginning. It starts when people see the trailer, it starts when people buy the game, but it goes all the way up to starting up the game and playing the game, and not only that, but also how do people talk about the game outside of playing it. So what do we offer as a social experience? And UI and UX designers work on making the experience and adding meaning to the experience of the game. And sometimes our job can feel like this. You can work months on a really nice design and people still won't know how to use it, but that's okay. Visual identity or iterative design, I still have not figured out what to name this chapter, so, you know. What I want to encourage designers is to think less of interactions as systems and more of them as part of a story. So don't only ask yourself what is it, but also ask yourself who are they? And in the case of Satisfactory, we've added Katarina, Parks, and Steve, who are important characters in our game. And while they never physically appear in the game, the people that are playing the game, they will hear them. And they do add to that player fantasy that I've been talking about. And the narrative of Satisfactory doesn't necessarily drive the game, but it does make the player aware of their actions and consequences. So another way how we want to reflect on that is making the player feel like they are part of this story. And this is a little animation that we do whenever the player starts up the game. And this is where you can see that you can add narrative as a tool for your visual identity. So don't limit yourself to just using narrative, but see it as a tool that can strengthen that game experience. And Katarina and Steve have been a big part of creating the flavor for our UX, so how we treat players in and outside of the game. Another example is when we were looking for alpha testers, we wrote the recruitment text as a way that Katarina would write a recruitment email for new employees. And with that, I also want to talk about onboarding. So one of our initial ideas for onboarding was to have a cardboard factory in a training facility. It seemed like a really fun idea at the time, but it turned out to be intrusive and restrictive. And the reason for doing that, or the reason why people felt like that, was that during user tests we noticed that we took the player outside of the context. So they didn't understand why they were learning these mechanics of the game outside of the context where they were going to perform those actions. And it was a separate environment that had nothing to do with the alien planet that the player found themselves on. So the tutorial was highly intrusive, and we piled goals upon goals on the player, and we tried to add too much story fluff. So something important to remind yourself of here is that you should not let your intention overpower the player's experience. So when we realized that the onboarding was confusing for our players, we added a little onboarding sequence. I'm sorry, this is the wrong video. I don't get why it's there. But it's okay, we'll roll with it. So we added an onboarding sequence, which was a little introduction video to the player. This is the right video, nice. And now when the player starts up a new game, they are greeted with this little onboarding video, which is instructive, but it's straight to the point. So we're not adding too much story fluff. And we realized that we needed to be straight to the point with this. And instead of having a strong narrative that guides our player during the onboarding process, we chose to go for an AI that guides our player instead of having a strong narrative. So like I said, the onboarding process is straight to the point, and there is no over-explaining or over-complicating. And with the characters that we have in the game, even though they're not physically present, they do stand for a specific element of each game. So our onboarding character now is an AI that we made because it's straight to the point and there's no emotional connection. It gives the exact information that is necessary for the player, and is purely focused on gameplay. So a takeaway on this is don't let your intention overpower the player's experience. When you notice that something doesn't work, no matter how fun that idea is, like the cardboard factory that we had, you need to let it go. And you can use narrative as a tool to power your visual identity. And as my good friend Hannah says, it's the glitter glue that binds it all together. Shout out for Hannah. And now we'll talk about the process of learning, or our learning process about Satisfactory. So before we released Satisfactory on early access, we built it on 3 core pillars, which was construct, automate, explore, and exploit. And these pillars really taught us the way we wanted to make the mechanics and features for Satisfactory. But after we released the game, we learned that we have 3 player types, and not necessarily 3 player types that we expected. So I think that as a developer, it's important to stay flexible and allow your core pillars to change when you notice that they are changing. So one of our player types is the thrill seeker, which is the type that finds innovative ways to progress through the game, such as in this case, putting explosives on their car and killing enemies instead of going out hunting them. Now we have the engineer, which is the player that we expected the most, which is the number cruncher, the optimizer, the people that really plan out their factories and try to do it the best way that they can. And we have the role player, so in this case, our player built fix-it headquarters in the game, and it really adds to their experience because they can create their own story and they have the freedom to do so in Satisfactory. Another thing that I want to talk about is what we learned a lot about is scale and content. So the build menu in Satisfactory, or the build mechanic, is the main mechanic basically in Satisfactory and what we've woven the game around. However, the interaction has changed a lot over the years because we had little content at the beginning and the content is just growing and growing. So what you need to remember is that new features can always be implemented, or features can even be replaced or removed. And what works for 50 items doesn't work necessarily for 500 items. So evaluate how your mechanics are going to ripple out and affect other mechanics, but also how they're possibly going to affect your main mechanic. And what I also want to talk about is consistency. So use consistency when it makes sense. As UI designers, we have a tendency to stay consistent all the time. But don't force consistency when you realize it's only confusing your player. And sometimes a mechanic can be experienced much better when it's not consistent. And what we learned is that we need to think smart with our amount of content. This is another example of where we were thinking in terms of systems mostly in the beginning, and then later allowed the story to shape this interaction. And this is what the build menu looks like now, where it's much more this feeling of actually opening an operating system and working with an operating system. And one of the biggest things that changed with the building mechanic is instead of having the player browse in real time while they're building, we now let them browse first before they're actually building something, so it's paced much better. A different example is about testing early and testing often. So we wanted to add a cute little pop-up to tell people that they should take breaks every 2 hours. And initially we were very happy about this, but there is a big confirm button right there in the middle, as you can see here. And people weren't too happy about this because we didn't test it well. So I'm just going to read these out loud. Seriously, no one on the team thought that this wasn't a bit too intrusive. Talk about arrogance. The next time you guys have a crazy idea like this, maybe put it into the experimental version first for testing. Another person, a bit more positive. I don't mind it, and I understand why messages like this can help. It would be nice if the pop-up didn't happen while fighting monsters though. And maybe have it happen after 2 hours of active playing. If I go AFK to take a break and let my factory run, it should reset the 2-hour timer. Now comes the most negative one. I haven't played the game in a while. Is this really in the game? Wow, I won't be playing this game ever again now. What the hell is this bullshit? Why would they put something so stupid in the game? If I want to play for 8 hours, let me play. So you can have a really good intention, but it can have a very bad result. Of course, there's also nice people. It's pretty neat when your game developers care more about your well-being than you or others do. And yeah, the intention here was nice, And although people received it positively, it is important to look at all experiences. So right now it's just a little animation that comes in every 2 hours, and you can turn it off in the options. So you need to think about those things. The takeaway of the process of learning is that you need to learn from your players and that you should allow yourself to learn from your players. And design is never done, and skill and content can or will change the way that people affect or interact with your game. A classic is to test early and test often. And an unpopular opinion maybe is to fight the urge to stay consistent sometimes. So in the future, right now we are working on update number 3, which we have planned in December. We're working hard on that at the moment. And we are talking and looking into accessibility. So we've already made a few experimental options that we're currently testing, but we need to look into how and where do we apply accessibility. And next Monday I am also going to the Games Accessibility Conference in London, so I hope to learn a bunch of stuff there that I can share with all of you in the future. And of course, we're learning from our mistakes. Where can we do better? And I think accessibility is a large part of that. So as UI and UX are things that go hand in hand with the entire development cycle, so is accessibility. We've learned now that it should go hand in hand and it's not an afterthought that you just put on when you're done with it. Yeah, that is the end of my talk, so thank you all for being here.